this is a book review. The book is Oscar Wilde in America. And what it's really about is especially his younger years. He came to the USA when he was about 27 years old as part of a promotion for a big opera. He was sort of like the character in there called Bunthorne. And he labeled himself as the Messiah of aesthetics, that he was coming to civilize America with the gospel of art. Okay, he had gone to Oxford and he had learned from Professor John Ruskin, the greatest art critic who ever lived. So anyways, I'll go back. I'll give you a little more backstory on this, but there's just one portrait photograph of him. And just the point I want to make, he would be in this luxurious coat, dressed up like quite a dandy with a fancy ring and a walking stick. And he was a very tall guy. He was 6'3", which was extremely tall for those days. And he was from Ireland. He became so famous at a young age. He was famous even before he'd done anything, you know. And they sort of say that fame comes from your achievements, but notoriety comes from your persona. So he had a dramatic persona. We're going to talk about what that was all about. So here's a painting by William Frith in 1883 of Oscar Wilde at an art gallery, because everybody would crowd around him to hear what he had to say about art, because he had been educated, you know, at Oxford. They had a really good art program and classics program, so he knew a lot, and he was very funny and entertaining, and we'll get into some of that. I have a picture of Oscar Wilde on the wall in my bathroom, actually at my old house. When my wife divorced me and I had to move out, but this is my magic bathroom with pictures of some people I thought were interesting, my heroes, or some people who just I thought were inspiring in some way. Okay, so there's Oscar Wilde right there. There's Ruth Heydrich on there. Okay. I'd like to see inspiring things when I walk into my bathroom to motivate me, to energize me. All right, now we'll talk some more about Oscar Wilde's background. He was Irish. Both of his parents were from Ireland, and they were Protestants, though, so more, you know, connected to England in the Anglican sense. Most Irish people are Roman Catholics. His mother was a very distinguished lady, Lady Jane Wilde. Esperanza was her pen name. She was a good writer and a poet. She wrote some famous poems, especially about the Irish famine. And though his parents were aristocrats, they were seen as friends of the common people, the Catholics in Ireland. She would have big parties at the home, and she would put on an elaborate show with a lot of fancy conversation and costumes. And Oscar Wilde saw that growing up, and you know, she'd have lots of fancy quotes and little paradox thrown into her speech and her writing, and he learned from all that. Father was a well-known ENT doctor. He got knighted eventually for his work. They sent him to Trinity College Dublin initially. He had a real famous classics tutor over there named the Reverend John Mahaffey, who was sort of like the greatest storyteller in Ireland. So again, he was around big, fancy social personas right since he was a little boy, and he loved it all. Okay, and he was brilliant. You know, he's homeschooled initially, and he could, translate Greek and Latin, and he became a real scholar of the classics. When he went to Oxford, he won awards for Greek translation, and he knew he wanted to be famous. He didn't even know how he was going to do it initially, but he just had this giant ego. He said, if I'm not famous, I'll be notorious. Okay, and like we said, fame tends to come from achievements, from deeds, notoriety, from persona. And he had the big ego to do it. And he knew he was brilliant. A typical quote of him wanting to become famous: the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. He finally found what would be his big gimmick, and that would be to talk about art when he went to the lectures of John Ruskin. John Ruskin is the English professor in the mid-1800s who was a big supporter of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood of Painters, who wanted to paint in a style that came before Raphael. They felt Raphael was starting to get too fancy and making the emphasis of his paintings on the beauty of the painting rather than the message of, like the Christian method, the Christian message rather than their artistic skill. Anyways, and they were really a takeoff on the Nazarene painters, again, Christian painters from Germany before that time. Okay, and he also keyed on to this idea of the English Renaissance. And there really was a Renaissance in the mid-1800s, the Victorian Renaissance, you might call it, which coincided with the Catholic Revival, with Cardinal John Henry Newman, architect Augustus Welby Pugin. So there was tremendous achievement in England in the 1800s. Okay, they had a long-standing rule of Queen Victoria for like 70 years. And they also had, peace, prosperity. and Christianity. Those are things that go together to produce magnificent art. There was an opera. He became famous at a young age, just in his 20s, from dressing wild and being a fun talker at these art shows and whatnot. And they made cartoons about him in the popular magazine in England, Punch. And they wrote an opera. The guys, Gilbert and Sullivan, didn't particularly like Oscar Wilde. They thought he was effeminate, and of course he's from Ireland. But they made jokes about him in their opera. And then they got the idea they wanted to take their opera to the USA, and they thought that he'd be the perfect person to send out to the wild macho frontier, the sort of effeminate guy who walks around carrying a book of poetry. And so that's how he got funded to go on this big grand tour of USA when he was only 27 years old and not yet famous. But he knew he wanted to promote himself, and he did lots of things. It became a super famous trip around the USA, just like Charles Dickens had traveled throughout the USA as a writer, and so had Alexis de Tocqueville back in 1835. And it became a very famous tour. He would sell out almost everywhere he went. And he was, again, safe. And when people here's typical things people tell, like somebody told him to shut up. And he said, well, I could control myself and not speak, but it would be too selfish. I could deny myself the pleasure of talking, but I could not deny others the pleasure of listening. When he was at USA Customs, they asked him, do you have anything to declare? He said, I have nothing to declare but my genius. So I always loved the guy because here he is, this Irish guy, and he goes to England where everybody hates him, and he becomes their best playwright and like one of their most famous celebrities in their whole country. And he was such a clever, wonderful talker. You couldn't meet him and not like him. The other things he said, other thing he would say when people would criticize him, oh, that is the compliment mediocrity pays to those who are not mediocre. When he talked about, storytelling, he'd say the ultimate in storytelling is, the ultimate sin in storytelling is to be dull. When they wanted to photograph him for a portrait, he said, no, I don't want a portrait, I want a picture. They go, what do you mean you want a picture? He says, a picture is more than a portrait. He says, a portrait is just the person's appearance, in one snapshot in time, but a picture is something that tells a story, like a painting. So he would have these elaborate costumes and poses to create an effect with his photographs of himself. So big time. He would then sell autographed photos of himself. This 27-year-old guy who really hadn't written anything significant yet would sell autographed photos of himself in theater lobbies for the operas and whatnot. He was very funny, and he got letters of introduction from some famous people and from the company that was sponsoring him to promote the opera, so he could go meet other literary stars like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Louisa May Alcott, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Henry James, Ulysses Grant, Jefferson Davis. So he was meeting all the celebrities. He said, celebrity is contagious. Meet as many of them as you can. If you wish for a reputation and fame in the world, take every opportunity of advertising yourself. Praise local celebrities. Go and meet them. He said, I have single-handedly civilized America by spreading the gospel of art, the new religion of beauty. And some called him the Messiah of aesthetics. So that was kind of the attitude back then, that Europe was a sophisticated, educated place, and the Americans were these wild, semi-barbarian pioneers. A typical Oscar Wilde quote here is, a man's face is his autobiography. A woman's face is her work of fiction. Okay, and he was trying to make himself like a work of art, Let's see. An acquaintance that begins with a compliment is sure to develop into a real friendship. It starts in the right manner. Only shallow people do not judge by appearances. Okay, let's go to the next slide here. Oh, I guess that's all I got. We'll just leave it at that for this one. Yeah, I got tons more Oscar Wilde quotes. He's like one of the most quoted authors ever. Also, I'll make one last comment about Oscar Wilde before we stop. I'm going to do next a book review of the great Shakespeare play, King Lear. In the entire play, though, there's only one good line. Only one good line. Whereas Oscar Wilde, he'll write something like The Importance of Being Earnest or The Picture of Dorian Gray, and there won't be as great of an overall story. But there'll be tons of good one-liners. There's a lot to be said for that. At the end of the day, when you get done reading the Oscar Wilde and The Importance of Being Earnest or something, you'll have more good quotes that you want to reuse than you will after reading King Lear. But, King Lear is unforgettable. I'll talk about that next. Anyways, I hope you found this helpful.